So you know how my last video was about a podcast that very few people have heard of and which has a premise that it's not uncomplicated to explain? And the one before that was about a short-lived Canadian TV series from the early 2000s that you could arguably say has a cult following, but a very, very small one. And before that, my sparse postings on here have included such topics as aromanticism and one-person Shakespeare skits. You'd think, looking at all that I couldn't find anything more niche to talk about here. Anyway, this video is about Fullmetal Bazinga. Fullmetal Bazinga is a semi-scripted audio drama framed as a Big Bang Theory watch-along podcast, which was released weekly between September 2018 and May 2019, concurrent with the release of the 12th and final season of The Big Bang Theory. It was created by and stars Tess Havezel, Giovanni Colantonio, David Flam, and Greg Schultz, all playing fictionalized versions of themselves. Quick note, at the time the podcast was released, Tess was still going by their dead name, and so if you decide to listen to the podcast after watching this video, be aware that that is the case. I'll be referring to both Tess and their character by the name Tess in this video. The four co-hosts have also been making a video game podcast since 2017 called Left Trigger, Right Trigger, and the idea for Fullmetal Bazinga actually came from an episode of LTRT. I found out about Fullmetal Bazinga from the podcast The Ones and Future Nerd in November 2019, and since then I have listened to it probably 4 times. I feel like it's maybe been 5, but I know for a fact it's been at least 4. Once in November 2019, once in July 2020, once in the spring of 2022, and most recently over the course of 2 days in April of 2023. I feel like I also did a listen summer of 2021, but I might be making that up. I've also re-listened to parts of the podcast while making this video. I may be the person who has listened to Fullmetal Bazinga the most. I don't know that. There could be other people out there who meet or exceed my number of listens, but I don't get the sense there are a lot of FMB superfans out there listening to the show over and over. And if there are, please tell me who you are so we can duel to the death and I can assume my rightful throne. This video is a challenge! The point is, I've listened to the podcast 4-ish times, and I don't know why. Every once in a while, I experience the urge to re-listen to the whole thing, and every time I comply and enjoy myself immensely. I like this podcast in a way that feels not totally in keeping with what it is, and which is impossible for me to explain. It's a very makes no damn sense, compels me though kind of feeling, and since I don't know what else to do with that, I have compiled a comprehensive explanation of the lore, canon, plot, and general weirdness of Fullmetal Bazinga here for your benefit in video form. And if the folks over at LTRT are watching this, thank you for making this strange, funny, and deeply compelling piece of art. I hope I've done it justice. Our story begins long ago on the island of Bazinga. Now, a few things to know about Bazinga. The island has a very rich oral tradition, and storytellers and bards are held in high esteem. Because of this, how sources from the island discuss things often combines and conflates the literal and the metaphorical, and understanding the factual information conveyed by writings in Old Bazinglish can be challenging as a result. Also, every year on Bazinga is referred to as Bazinga Teen, and a while back, anthropologists visited the island and wrote the Bazingamicon. Those last 2 things aren't important, but I did need to tell you. For our purposes, there are 3 important storytellers who all lived on the island of Bazinga around the same time: Chuck Lorre, Bill Prady, and Doug Lindsay. Chuck Lorre is a giant spider who came into being prior to humanity and lived on one side of the island. He got his start as a bit of a trickster. He would lure audiences in, and as they were listening to his stories, steal money from them while they were mesmerized. He is a master manipulator, and he draws power for this manipulation from people paying attention to him. Some sources will refer to him as a god, but this is likely the result of combining the literal and the metaphorical. While he does have very, very strong powers of manipulation, he is not able to create anything on his own, and therefore calling him a god is inaccurate. It is more likely reflective of the weight that storytelling held on Bazinga and the fact that being a master storyteller is likened to having powers of creation and therefore comparable to godhood. He is definitely a giant spider, though. That's not metaphorical. You'd think it would be, but it's not. Doug Lindsay was a bard who lived on the island, and around the same time that Lorre was getting his start tricking people, he started playing songs in his local pub to support his sick father and working mother. He was famed for his beautiful voice, and he grew so popular that soon he was getting crowds from all over the island. Now, his crowds grew so big that he was affecting the people coming to listen to Lorre's stories, so Lorre found out about him and approached Doug about joining forces and having him travel with Lorre's show and play music with it. Doug declined since he didn't want to have to leave his father. That night, Lorre followed him going home and attacked him, cutting out his tongue and thus robbing him of his beautiful voice. From then on, Doug Lindsay would be known as the Silent. Bill Prady. Bill Prady lived on the opposite side of the island as Lorre, and unlike Lorre, was a master storyteller with talents in that area that Lorre never possessed. I know I said before that the reason Chuck Lorre is sometimes called a god is because he was a master storyteller, and the weight placed in storytelling is likened to godhood, so how can he be a master storyteller and likened to a god if he doesn't actually have the same abilities that Prady has? I'll get to it. Lorre, sometime after cutting out the Silent's tongue, heard about Prady and challenged him to a storytelling contest. Prady agreed, and he went off to write his story, but that night, after it was completed, Lorre snuck in and stole the scrolls on which it was written, taking them back to his village where he read them out to his people, bringing them under his control, which was his plan the whole time in challenging Prady to that contest. This is the start of Lorre being credited with storytelling abilities that are not rightly his, and being seen as a master storyteller when in fact it's all just more manipulation. So, in the morning, Prady finds out about what happens and he goes to confront Lorre, but Lorre, now being able to control his villagers, has them fight back. In retaliation, Prady recruits a bunch of warlocks and a war ensues. This would be the first of the Bazinga Wars. You'll see that I have created two sides, the agents of Lorre and the agents of Prady, consisting currently of villagers and warlocks. This will grow as her story moves on. But before we can get into that, we have to go back a bit. Doug Lindsay, the Silent. While the Bazinga Wars were starting, Doug Lindsay spent a year in a deep depression. Eventually, his mother came to him and said that there might be a way for him to regain his voice if he were to climb to the top of the tallest mountain on Bazinga. Doug decided to do this, and he succeeded, and at the top of this mountain he met a giant being made of clouds who said that he could restore Doug's voice, not his tongue, but his voice, if Doug agreed to play for him for all eternity, play music for him for all eternity. Doug Lindsay agreed, and now he resides in the Cloud Golem's lair. I will be removing him from our wall, since he is no longer an active player in the Bazinga Wars. However, there are times that he leaves. The Bazinga Wars were actually a series of multiple conflicts between Prady and Lorre over the years. And they would sometimes come to periods of peace, which would be represented by Bazingivings. There were a number of Bazingivings over the years, but only the first one is relevant right now. So, Prady and Lorre were able to put the fighting aside, and they made peace. They found themselves gathered together in Lorre's homestead, and this was attended by the warlocks, Prady's warlocks, who are the assertive, the mysterious, and the sincere, as well as the Silent, Doug Lindsay. Doug Lindsay the Silent attended the first Bazingiving and gave a speech to all there. But the peace didn't last. The fighting started again, they made peace again, there were more Bazingivings, more fighting, and eventually everything built to a boiling point. the warlocks and Prady came together to trap Lorre on the island once and for all. And this worked, and Lorre is still trapped there to this day. And everyone else who lived on the island is now in a state of diaspora. However, the warlocks and Prady were not without losses. In order to trap Lorre, Bill Prady had to give up himself and was shattered into the 7 Prady shards. And the warlocks were brainwashed by Lorre and brought under his control, becoming the Knights of Lorre. I've added a little Knights tab under the Agents of Lorre. I kept the warlocks under Prady though because they are originally under his domain and I want to represent that. In the aftermath of the Bazinga Wars, there are a few things happened. Lorre's followers erected the Bazinga Museum, which tells the story of the Bazinga Wars, although with a bias in Lorre's favor. Also, Lorre is kept trapped on the island by a multi-dimensional veil, but he is able to reach through this veil and manipulate people without leaving the island. His powers and limitations from the island are as follows. He is unable to create things of his own. He can only manipulate already existing things. This was always the case. He can only reach people through the TV shows that he controls. He gains power from viewership and people paying attention to said TV shows. He can draw people to the island to drain their essences for more power. This is reflected by a significant dip in the viewership numbers of his TV shows, as people who would otherwise be watching are drawn to the island, to him. He can control people as puppets or as vessels to his will. He can make people forget things. This will be very important later. And people under Lorre's manipulation can see ways out of it, but don't take them, and this is part of what makes him so insidious. Okay, so Lorre is trapped on the island. He has these powers, but what does he want? If he gets enough attention from the shows that he controls, he will gain enough power to collapse the universe back into a single point, creating a captive audience for him for all eternity. This is known as the Great Convergence. The most notable show he controls in order to gain this power is, of course, the Big Bang Theory. The universe of the Big Bang Theory is actually one that exists parallel to the universe of Fullmetal Bazinga and was created to house the Prady shards, and the Knights, previously the Warlocks, were sent there to watch over them. This means that all of the events that play out on the Big Bang Theory are actually a part of this ongoing struggle between Prady and Lorre, and the idea that there is a Bill Prady and a Chuck Lorre on Earth is actually just more manipulation on the part of Lorre. The events of the show are all actually happening out there in the multiverse, and the purpose of it was always to contain the shards. So what exactly are the Prady shards? The flesh Prady that exists here on Earth, the one credited with co-creating Big Bang Theory and other TV shows, is actually just a puppet for Lorre. And the actual Prady, Prady's essence, if you will, has been split into 7 shards. The location of 3 of them has been confirmed, although there is also speculation as to the location of 3 others, or 3 other possible locations, I should say. The unconfirmed locations include Chick from the Muppets, notably not a part of the Big Bang Theory, but based off Prady's appearance, Leonard's safe that he keeps, and a meteorite which appears in Season 12, Episode 14 of The Big Bang Theory. Confirmed shard locations known to contain a shard of Prady are the Chinese takeout from the show's opening, the baby who cries like an old man, one of Bernadette and Howard's twin children, and Sheldon Cooper. That's right. Sheldon Cooper is actually just a husk and houses the largest Prady shard, the shard over which Lorre exerts the most control. This show exists to keep putting Sheldon through these lessons week after week that he never learns, because that will stop him from joining with the other Prady shards, because if he were to do that, then Prady could reform and stop Lorre once and for all. Let's move over to talking about the warlocks who served Prady and have now been corrupted into being Knights of Lorre. We have Leonard the Assertive, who is the strongest of the Knights, Howard the Mysterious, also referred to as Moist, who is the most powerful in his abilities as a warlock and led the sealing of Lorre on the island, and Raj the Sincere, whose own nature is most at odds with what Lorre is forcing him to do. The Knights were created in a hot, dense state at an unknown point in the past, and none of them are naturally agents of Lorre. They're only doing his bidding because, as you'll remember, they were brainwashed during that final battle. And some part of their nature is always trying to fight against Lorre and break through his influence. Because of this, Lorre needs a way to maintain his control over the Knights from his remote place on the island, and the way he does this is through sex. Anytime one of the Knights bangs someone, that reasserts Lorre's control over said knight. Anytime one of them goes a while without banging, and they're able to start to break through his abilities and show through their warlock nature a little bit more. To the end of preventing this from happening, there are a number of other agents of Lorre and his villagers who show up in the show, and these include Anu, who's Raj's love interest in season 12, Bernadette, Amy, and Penny, the partners of the various knights, as well as the Sheldon Sharp, and most notably, Bernadette has also been entrusted with the grim duty of watching over the Pretty Shard in one of the babies. When the Knights are able to shake off Lorre's control, it takes different forms. Leonard becomes more assertive, fitting his title. Howard the Mysterious indulges more in his interest in magic, and you'll often see other characters sort of steering him away from that or discouraging that in him to prevent him realizing his warlock nature. Raj the Sincere is incapable of speaking to women he finds attractive because that's actually his sincere nature showing through and stopping him from lying to them. Because if he were to speak, he would tell the truth because he's the sincere, and he'd tell them about Pretty and Lorre and the ongoing battle, and we can't be having that. Also, anytime Raj gets drunk and says inappropriate and sexist things, that's just pure Lorre influence showing through. One other point of note when it comes to the Knights is that there is such a thing as the mind cap. The mind cap can be used by the Knights for their own purposes, but it can also be used to shield a shard and you allow it to communicate to other Prady shards. When the mind cap turns up in the Big Bang Theory, it takes the form of a scooter helmet. So, there it is, the Deep Lorre, the ongoing struggle between the agents of Lorre and the agents of Prady. But that's not the whole story. Two sides locked in battle for the fate of the universe, sure, but what about the multiverse? What about the third party? GenCorp is the company to end all companies. The corporation so big that not only do they manufacture every product under the sun, they manufacture reality itself. They span timelines. They have existed since before organic life. They employ everyone from Cesium Adams to Garfield, and they want you to watch their TV shows. GenCorp, reality you can trust. Okay, but what actually is GenCorp? GenCorp got its start eons and eons ago as GenZen, a company founded by Stephen Jenkins and Richard Zendel with the goal of producing media for the universal audience. Basically, how this works is they record events from one reality and then turn it into TV that they can sell in another one. The first three shows that formed GenZen's programming base were about the formation of water, the movement of the planets, and the first protein. But they really got their start with the arrival of organic life. They had programs detailing the emergence of sentience, the agricultural revolution, and their first big hit, the Bazinga Wars, which let them become the media empire they would one day end up being. Stephen Jenkins actually had his own part in the Bazinga Wars, albeit a minor one. He was the one who gave Doug Lindsay the Silent the ability to speak again, and now Doug Lindsay must play what we know of as the Big Bang Theory theme song for Jenkins whenever he requires it. The Silent has been added to the GenCorp list. His stint as the Cloud Golem wasn't Jenkins' only time among the organics. He was in a band once, but much of the details are left for us to guess at. Richard Zendel also had his time among organic life, but again, a lot of that is left to the imaginations. It implied that he was Benedict Arnold, and we know for sure that he embodied the concept of hunger for a while. Actually, at the time that GenZen was getting its success with its Bazinga Wars programming, Richard Zendel left the company to go do his own adventures among the organic. With Zendel's departure, GenZen rebranded into GenCorp and became the biggest company in the history of companies, almost subsuming reality with their power. They became so big that everyone wanted to work for them, and I mean everyone. So GenCorp instituted a lottery program whereby every couple years, every so often, new employees are admitted via a supposedly random draw. I say supposedly random because while it is definitely somewhat random, there is an element of randomness to the selection, it's strongly implied that that's not the only thing that goes into the lottery selection process. GenCorp kept expanding, and by the year 3058, in addition to shows, it was making medicines, concepts, emotions, vehicles, and realities. But its cornerstone was still providing entertainment to a universal audience. To that end, GenCorp employs operators who do sort of like the filming type of thing, light bringers who supply light, brokers whose full job is never like totally articulated. There's also production managers who are kind of like studio execs, and contract workers like animal wranglers, and people who work in GenCorp's studios monitoring feeds from different realities rather than going down to those realities themselves the way operators or light bringers would. The employees of GenCorp definitely aren't all human, and even the ones who are probably have some sort of future weirdness thing going on, because despite the fact that like you could be employed as a human operator, you wouldn't go down to a reality until you've had like hundreds, maybe even thousands of years of experience with sort of training and other responsibilities in the GenCorp offices. One of the many shows that GenCorp produces is The Big Bang Theory, but before I get into what we know about how that works, I need to take a break and move over to talking about jumpers. Jumpers are people who are able to travel between different timelines and universes and who have a greater awareness of their alternate selves. It's also possible that there's a higher likelihood that a version of a jumper will exist in like more realities, and or maybe it's just that there's like a higher degree of consistency in how those alternate selves manifest in different timelines. Again, we don't learn everything about how this works. One thing we do know is that there is a recall phrase which, when uttered by a jumper, will cause that person to jump into GenCorp's reality, regardless of whether they're aware of their jumper nature or not. Now, the important thing to know about jumpers for our story is that Dave, one of our hosts, is eventually revealed to be one. He is not aware of his jumper nature for most of the podcast, and he only finds out when he accidentally says the recall phrase. We are introduced through Dave to a variety of alternate universe Fullmetal Bazingas and other podcasts, and because Dave is a jumper, there is always a Dave. There's always a Dave. That's how it works in every world through every permutation of reality. If there is a podcast, there will be a Dave. That's the rule. And just for fun, let's run through some of the different universes we see throughout the show. In terms of alternate Fullmetal Bazingas, we've got Fullmetal Bazinga, a Big Bang Theory fan cast hosted by Carson DiMaggio, Regina Catalina, an alternate Greg Schultz, and Dave. In this universe, these four hosts also have the podcast Left Bumper, Right Bumper. Fullmetal Bazinga, a show that is dedicated to comparing the filmography of Steven Kubrick to The Big Bang Theory. This is hosted by two unknown hosts, an alternate Giovanni and Dave. Fullmetal Bazinga, a podcast which is watching and reviewing the Big Gong Theory and talking about percussion, hosted by two unknown hosts, an alternate Tess and Dave. In terms of alternate universe versions of other podcasts, we have a version of the Bazinga Boys, a Big Bang Theory watch-along podcast hosted by Vorn, Pete, HumorBot 4000, and Dave. Bazinga Logic, an alternate universe version of Fuzzy Logic hosted by V. Silverman, Andrew Prensky, Ed Rossini, and Dave. Eels Eating a Pizza, an alternate version of the Amazon Book Club hosted by all the usual hosts plus Dave, and a version of Debate This hosted by all its usual hosts plus Dave. All those podcasts do exist in the real world, with the exception of Eels Eating a Pizza. The other alternate Dave we meet is Studio Dave, which brings us back around to GenCorp. Studio Dave works in the audio-visual entertainment department at GenCorp, specifically in, as his nickname would suggest, the studio. He works on the Big Bang Theory, which in the universe of GenCorp doesn't just mean being part of the team that works on the story about those 4 wacky nerd friends we all know and hate. Nor does Studio Dave's job deal with specifically turning the reality in which the Brady shards are all housed into entertainment for this reality. What I have inferred from the information we are given is that Studio Dave's job consists of monitoring any Big Bang related podcast and possibly other non-podcast Big Bang related media from across different timelines, or just events that relate to the ongoing Bazinga Wars fallout. This leads me to my understanding, which I'll admit is mostly speculation, that any given GenCorp show is not just as simple as taking the events of one reality and turning it into television from another, or in some cases, manufacturing a reality to turn that into television for all realities. Rather, it also includes taking any media that is created in response to their shows and any events that happen in response to their shows and propagating those throughout different timelines for consumption. Fullmetal Bazinga itself, the fictional podcast that you can go and download, is implied, to me at least, to be a GenCorp product. We are listening to it in our world as a work of fiction, but in the universe in which it exists, it is actual events that are being documented and that GenCorp is then taking and releasing into our universe as fiction. Maybe. Again, I'm only like halfway confident in that interpretation of things because a lot of the information we get about GenCorp is not explicitly stated. And to be clear, I think that's an asset. I think GenCorp works a lot better as this mysterious background player about which information is only slowly revealed, rather than as something that we get a lot of explicit details about. But anyway, my reasons for thinking that FMB is a GenCorp product are that one, Studio Dave, as part of his job, monitors the feeds from our host's reality, and two, the whole show ends off with a message from Stephen Jenkins about what we've just heard. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might be wondering how The Big Bang Theory can be both a show created by Lorre to gather power, and also something created and distributed by GenCorp. To which my answer is, it's complicated, and again, one of those things that's not explicitly explained in the show, but my understanding of it is this, and since we're talking about multiple universes, I'll try to be as concise as possible. Universe A exists. In it exists Chuck Lorre and the island of Bazinga. The Bazinga Wars happen, and Lorre is trapped, but he is able to control a puppet version of Bill Prady and a proxy version of himself in Universes A's Hollywood. He uses those puppets to create the Big Bang Theory. The events of Fullmetal Bazinga happen in this universe unless clearly a result of jumping to another one. Universe B exists. It only starts existing at the end of the Bazinga Wars, and in it are the Prady Shards and the Knights of Lorre. Chuck Lorre is able to control it using the multidimensional veil and broadcasts the events that happen in Universe B into Universe A as television. Universe X exists. In it exists GenCorp. GenCorp employees are able to travel into other universes, including Universes A and B. They enter Universe A and record the events of the Bazinga Wars and release it as television in Universe X and others. They enter Universe B and record the events that are a result of Lorre's manipulation and release it as television in Universe X and others. Sometimes they also exert their own manipulations on the events of Universe B. It is unclear how much influence GenCorp had over the events of the Bazinga Wars, and aside from Jenkins' stint as the Cloud Golem, but if they had more than that, it is quite possible that they had some degree of say in the formation of Universe B. It is also unclear how much of a hand they have, direct or indirect, in Lorre's abilities to broadcast the events of Universe B in Universe A, but honestly they're so powerful that they might. Hopefully that makes sense. It's what I'm able to gather from what we know about GenCorp, which, as I've said, is mostly question marks. Anything beyond that is moving even further into speculation, and I want to stick to what we know. Everything already confirmed about GenCorp, I've explained, and I've already covered all of the deep lore, so the pieces are in place for us to start explaining just what it is that happens in this podcast. Fullmetal Bazinga, a real show for humans and other sentient creatures, was supposed to be a watch-along podcast for the 12th and final season of The Big Bang Theory. The fictional versions of co-hosts Tess, Giovanni, Dave, and Greg set out to watch and review the season as it airs because, as we all know, the last season of any TV show is guaranteed to be the best, and as we are all well aware, watching anything other than the best season is a waste of time. Along the way, however, they start to uncover the deep lore and even be caught up in the conflict between Lorre and Brady. The podcast we listen to is also the one being released in fiction, and it contains their investigations, speculations, and reactions as they work through the information they find, and even documents their attempts to stop Chuck Lorre once and for all. But before I get into all that, let's go over the rules. The In Fiction podcast has a set of rules that the host must abide by each episode. They are as follows. 1. All hosts will watch the most recent episode of The Big Bang Theory, a show watched and enjoyed by humans and other sentient beings. 2. All discussion must be related to the latest episode, lore, and extended universe of The Big Bang Theory. And 3, following the law of equivalent exchange, they will dedicate precisely as much time to the show as the show gives to them. That's usually a clean 30 minutes, timed for our benefit and theirs. Once the time is up, all discussion ceases and they move on with their regular Sheldon-less lives. An additional rule that's a bit of an add-on to Rule 1 is that if any host misses an episode of the podcast, they cannot watch that week's episode of The Big Bang Theory. They can only listen to the podcast episode for that week and pick up on what they missed through context clues. Now, the important thing about these rules is that they end up functionally preventing any of the hosts from making progress on their shared investigations, except when they're recording the podcast, since they're not allowed to talk about The Big Bang Theory except on mic. They can do stuff on their own, follow up on leads, speculate, think about things, but any conversation they have is limited to those 30 minutes once a week. So yes, the rules are an in-fiction justification for why we get to hear everything important that happens. The Watsonian answer to why everything important plays out on mic, but it's a lot more effective, for me at least, here than it is in other time-sensitive in-fiction recordings. Also, there appears to be some sort of force or forces out there that require these rules to be followed as the podcast goes on. So, what actually happens on Fullmetal Bazinga? The first 4 episodes are all a fairly standard watch-along podcast, albeit one undertaken by 4 people who greatly dislike the show they're watching and have not willingly watched any of the preceding seasons. Questions discussed in this period include: are the straights okay? No, they are not. Which couple is the most unlikable? It changes. Is Chuck Lorre okay? Also no. And whether or not the show can be read as a satirization of the idea of heterosexual futurity. These questions don't vanish after those first couple of episodes, but they occupy increasingly less focus after a certain point, with the exception of is Chuck Lorre okay, which is a question discussed each episode by analyzing Chuck Lorre's vanity cards. Other than that, important things that happen in those first few episodes are the first use of the term deep lore in episode 3 and the first allusion to the Brady shards in episode 4, although they don't discuss it in depth at that time, nor do they start speculating about possible shard locations. Also in episode 4, Giovanni and Dave are absent. They fled to Serbia to escape the wrath of the young Sheldon. I will be marking anytime a host is absent here, so we can keep track. Episode 5 begins the period of discussing the deep lore in earnest, and episode 6 is when they start discussing how, if at all, Chuck Lorre can be stopped. Over the next several episodes, they'll just discuss a lot of the Bazinga history they're already aware of, and speculate on some possible locations for the Brady shards, as well as what Chuck Lorre could be trying to do with his control over the Knights and Sheldon. Along the way, we get a couple of noteworthy events. Episode 7 is significant because the episode of the Big Bang Theory they're discussing, the Grant allocation derivation, features characters named Kripke and the Crow Lady, who the hosts initially believed to be agents of Lorre, but are later revealed to be jumpers like Dave, who were only in the episode because they were doing contract gigs for GenCorp. More on them later. Furthermore, that same episode, Dave mentions the Bazinga Museum, and the hosts talk about it for a little bit, but Giovanni has never heard of it. Dave suggests the two of them go together before the next episode. That doesn't end up happening, but Giovanni does go on his own, and in that next episode, recaps a little bit of the conflict between Lorre and Prady, the Bazinga Wars as a whole, and the ultimate trapping of Lorre for any listeners who don't remember or just didn't take AP Bazinga studies. Dave doesn't know what he's talking about. He claims to have never heard of the Bazinga Museum, he doesn't remember mentioning it the previous episode, and the entire story of the Bazinga Wars is news to him. Remember that Chuck Lorre can make people forget things. In episode 9, Giovanni is absent for reasons unknown to the other hosts, and the remaining hosts are joined by Vorn from the podcast The Bazinga Boys. I've added Giovanni's absence to the list. The episode is fairly standard despite Giovanni's absence, but at the end of the episode, we get a message from him. He's on the island of Bazinga, and he's discovered something. Chuck Lorre isn't who they think he is. This, to me, marks the end of the first phase of the show, where the characters go from just discussing the Bazinga Wars and engaging in some light speculations about the possible locations of the Prady shards trapped in the show, to when it becomes personal. When they get involved in Lorre's web of manipulations and become more directly a part of the struggle against him. The next episode is the Thanksgiving episode. There's no new episode of the Big Bang Theory, so all the other hosts are gone, and Tess shares the story of the first Thanksgiving. I am not counting this as an absence for any of the other hosts because it is a special episode. However, Tess does say that the reason Giovanni was absent in episode 9 was because it was his partner's birthday. Now, the backstory of the Silent, and indeed his identity as Doug Lindsay, is not a widely known part of the history of the island of Bazinga. In fact, it's not known at all. So, when Tess gets to the part of the story of the first Thanksgiving where the Silent is mentioned, she gets confused. And as Tess reads out some Old Bazinglish text, the Silent appears. He speaks to Tess in Old Bazinglish. And when he leaves, Tess starts crying. And they don't know why. Episode 10 is a rerun. The hosts sit down to watch a new episode of The Big Bang Theory and instead get a rerun of Season 12, Episode 10, The Wedding Gift Wormhole. Giovanni and Tess have no memory of seeing this episode before, although Greg and Dave do. As they talk about it and the episode progresses, Tess does start to remember seeing the episode before, but nothing comes back to Giovanni. The conversation also reveals further ways beyond just this episode that Lorre has been manipulating their memories. Tess remembers Giovanni being gone for episode 9, but not episode 4. Dave has no recollection of either himself or Giovanni being gone for episode 4. Giovanni does, but he doesn't remember being gone for episode 9, and by extension, doesn't remember anything that happened on the island of Bazinga. It's also made clear through a couple of things that they say that Tess does not remember the Thanksgiving episode, and the other hosts haven't noticed it in the feed yet. And the biggest change, Giovanni does not recognize the name Chuck Lorre. Obviously, this whole episode is everyone being a little bit freaked out, but once Giovanni cannot remember who Chuck Lorre is, the rest of the hosts say they're going to end the episode there, and they wait for Giovanni to leave the call. Once he's gone, they have a conversation about how weird it is that he doesn't remember Chuck Lorre. They're about to wrap up and leave early themselves when Giovanni rejoins the call, having no recollection of recording the first part of the episode. They all decide to leave, and Tess starts crying again. Now, it is revealed later that what's going on here is that when Giovanni went to the island of Bazinga, he came face to face with Chuck Lorre, who scrambled his memory so that Giovanni could not remember who he was, anything that he saw on the island, or much of the discussion in the previous episodes relating to the Prady shards and the deep Lorre. This continues to affect Giovanni for the next couple of episodes, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Episode 10, for real this time, has a guest, Carlton Billingsley, a writer on The Big Bang Theory who's listened to the podcast and agreed to come on for an episode. Except that he's not a writer on The Big Bang Theory. At least, not from the same reality as our four hosts. He works for GenCorp as a part of the team turning the universe in which The Big Bang Theory is happening into television. He thought he was going on a podcast in a different alternate reality and wound up on this one instead. The hosts do not figure all this out, and at this point they don't even know GenCorp exists, but they do sort of start to realize that something is up as the episode goes on. They realize that none of them know how they got Carlton on the show. Tess got an email from Dave that Dave doesn't remember sending. Giovanni got an email from Tess, which Tess doesn't remember sending. Greg had no idea Carlton would be there at all. Dave doesn't mention how he found out or finding out in general, but also doesn't seem surprised to see Carlton there. Other important things about episode 10. Greg is the only one who remembers the previous week's episode, although Dave does remember finding his mic on. And Tess believes it's only been 1 week since episode 9, which was the episode before the Thanksgiving episode. Episode 11 is another rerun. Only Greg remembers seeing the episode before. And at the end of the episode is the first appearance of Studio Dave. Episode 11, for real this time, is a new year and things are back to normal. Normal watch-along podcast with no weird conspiracy stuff. At least that's what everyone is trying really hard to do until the end of the episode when Giovanni recognizes a filming location and starts to remember going to the island of Bazinga. He's about to reveal what he learned about Chuck Lorre, but before he can finish his sentence, each of the hosts is pulled away to a different reality, each with their own Dave, because there is always a Dave, as we know. Dave himself, it's revealed when everyone discusses this in episode 12, stayed in the reality we've been following and heard Giovanni say that Chuck Lorre is Stephen Jenkins. At the end of episode 12, Giovanni is able to remember what he was going to say and reveals to the other 3 hosts that Chuck Lorre is one of the 4 of them, just as the timer ends. Okay, so let's unpack some of that because a lot of plot stuff happens in those few episodes, and it really only makes sense if you understand all of the deep lore and all of the GenCorp stuff, and you know what happens later. So, you'll remember the thing trapping Chuck Lorre on the island of Bazinga is a multi-dimensional veil. My understanding is that because of this, he can reach with his manipulation into different realities, not just the one in which he exists. Using this, he was able to pull Greg, Giovanni, and Tess each into a different reality so that they are prevented from learning that he's one of the 4 of them, or which of the 4 of them he is. He either did this to Dave as well, just one that is way more similar to Dave's original reality than he did with the other 4 hosts, or, and I think this is more likely because Dave is a jumper, he just manipulated Dave's memories of events so that he remembers hearing Giovanni say the name Stephen Jenkins, and then the episode ending is normal. I'm more inclined to the latter explanation because it fits with Dave being one of the hosts whose memory has been most affected by Lorre's manipulation up until this point. After the scattering, that's what I call it when the non-Dave hosts jump into the different podcast dimension things. I don't know if they ever actually call that on the show, but the episode of The Big Bang Theory they're talking about at the time when it happens is called the paintball scattering. It seems fitting. After the scattering, Lorre then returned all the hosts back to their original timeline, and Giovanni's memory manipulation from his encounter with Lorre was still going strong enough that he couldn't remember which of the 4 of them Lorre is controlling. That's what's ultimately meant by Giovanni saying that Lorre is one of them, by the way. The hosts don't know for sure exactly what Giovanni meant at the time, but it's later revealed that Lorre is using one of them as a puppet, much the way that he does the Flesh Prady. Episode 13 begins what I like to call the suspicion era. Anything one of the hosts says, any oddness in their behavior, any possible clue in the Big Bang Theory itself, any and everything can be used to accuse someone of being Chuck Lorre. It's great. Between episodes 12 and 13, Giovanni went back and re-listened to old episodes in the feed and found the Thanksgiving episode that Tess recorded without any of the other hosts. This is the first time anyone has acknowledged this episode up until this point, and Tess still has no recollection of recording it. The end of episode 13 also features another big revelation, but in order to explain it, I have to go back to the wedding gift wormhole, where Sheldon and Amy are trying to solve what they think is a scavenger hunt, and they ask themselves the question, what's not tea? Now, our hosts discussed this at the time in episode 2 of the podcast, again in the first rerun episode, the false episode 10, and it comes up again at the end of episode 13. They're speculating on the silent and who that could possibly be, but the timer ends, halting their discussion. And Tess says that it's strange that all this memory stuff is happening because one of the things that they can remember is the line, what's not tea? And as she starts to go through the credits and read them out, she realizes that Lindsay, Linse, as it's spelled in Doug Lindsay's last name, is silent without the T. As this information dawns on them, Doug Lindsay appears, and the silent speaks. Released as its own episode in the feed, Doug shares with the hosts his backstory. He tells them that he wants to see Lorre fall, and in order to destroy Lorre, they must unlock the multidimensional veil, and since only Prady has the key, they must discover the resonance to do that on their own. In episode 14, the hosts break down a lot of what they learned from Doug Lindsay, and we learn that none of them remember how they got in touch with him to do their theme song, and none of them have noticed this up until now, despite Tess thanking him in the credits of every episode. This episode is also when speculation about the possible existence of a third party starts to come up, specifically with the introduction of Andy the Lightbringer, an employee of GenCorp, to the show The Big Bang Theory. The hosts still don't know about GenCorp, but they're starting to realize there could be other factions at play here rather than just Prady versus Lorre. Remember that we are still firmly in the suspicion era, and a lot of episode 15 is just accusations flying, particularly in the direction of Greg, who's been acting a little weird. And it turns out that part of that suspicion may actually be justified, not in the sense that Greg is Chuck Lorre per se, but the week after episode 15, Greg releases an episode into the feed that reveals he's actually been up to more than you'd expect based on the last couple episodes. And, okay, this episode is a masterpiece. It's a lot of fun and I enjoy it immensely. In it, Greg takes us through his investigative process in real time as he tries to unravel the mystery of just what is going on. He lands on the number 7, the number of Prady shards, as significant, and that leads him to the word heptagon. Remembering the reveal of the silence identity, he starts to look for anagrams and finds the ominous pathogen. But if you remove the G, you get the much less portentous phaeton or phonate. The most notable G on Fullmetal Bazinga, Giovanni. Of course, Greg realizes that his name also begins with G, and if he were to bring this finding to the other hosts, that would be cause for suspicion to be turned on him. Greg continues his investigation, which eventually leads him to uncovering Lorre's plans for the Great Convergence. And he ends the episode sure that Lorre must be stopped, but uncertain how to do it. In episode 16, all the other hosts have listened to Greg's episode and are, understandably, a little freaked out. And it certainly doesn't do anything to diminish the suspicions they all have of each other. Aside from that, most of the episode is spent on speculation about the third party and their motivations. This continues in episode 17, in which they discuss the Big Bang Theory, the D&D vortex. Basically, Will Wheaton, playing himself, has a D&D group of a bunch of celebrities also playing themselves, and also Stuart, one of the friends of the main four. The hosts realize that something is off about the D&D group and the role they're playing in this episode, and they try to figure out what's going on, and in doing so land on the fact that the group all work for the third party and are controlling the events of the episode somehow. And they're right. Kind of. All of the celebrities are in fact people from GenCorp's reality who were given a chance to be on the episode of The Big Bang Theory as what's basically a nice treat for them and a fun surprise for viewers back home. D&D group. The other big thing to happen in episode 17 is also related to GenCorp and pretty much launches us into the next main phase of the story. Toward the end of the episode, Giovanni confronts Dave about Studio Dave's various appearances in the feed, including a brief episode released on its own after Greg's Noir Detective Act, and another little clip at the end of episode 16. Giovanni thinks that it's just this reality's Dave doing something weird, and he accuses Dave of being up to something. While defending himself, Dave accidentally says the jumper recall phrase and vanishes. The next episode is a communications log released by GenCorp called A Fireside Chat and is narrated by Stephen Jenkins, following a day in the life of Studio Dave, during which we learn about the history of GenCorp and what happened to the Dave we've been following when he jumped. He was recalled into GenCorp's reality and appeared in Studio Dave's studio. Studio Dave found him and returned him to his reality using an emergency device, giving him a note that will be helpful as he did. While Dave is gone, the other hosts try desperately to find him. The cops are of no help since they won't take the recording of what happened seriously, so they're on their own. Greg gets a lead that takes him to the Midwest, and he is absent for episode 18, which Tess and Giovanni start recording on their own, and it's a way of holding on to some semblance of normalcy. And while they're recording, Dave comes back. Tess and Giovanni tell him about the GenCorp episode appearing in the feed, and try to ask him about what happened, but all he's able to tell them is that he's seen everything. He continues to act weird and a little distant for the rest of the show, which, you know what, you probably would too if you'd traveled through realities and seen everything. Like I mentioned before, I would say that episode 17, when Dave vanishes, pretty much marks the end of the suspicion era and when we start to enter the lead up to the finale. Dave's disappearance kind of overshadows questions about which of the hosts Chuck Lorre is controlling, and upon Dave's return, things start to shift their focus into getting to the island and stopping Lorre. In episode 19, Greg is back, but Giovanni is gone again, and the other hosts don't know where he went. Partway through, though, Tess decides to check their phone and finds that they have a voicemail from him saying that he figured out where the mine cap is and is gone to go get it. Dave has been trying to work out what's on the note that Studio gave him, and he figures out toward the end of the episode that it is music. And as he plays the song, he starts to glow as the energy from every dimension funnels into him. This is such a significant event that it ends up affecting the Big Bang Theory, the universe that takes place in, causing a flare in their outer space, which the characters react to and notice in the next episode. In episode 20, Giovanni is back with the mind cap. It is underwhelming. More importantly, Crypt and the Crow Lady were able to use what happened to Dave at the end of episode 19 to locate the hosts and send a crow to them, which shows up to try to lead them to the island of Bazinga. The other hosts are freaked out and don't know what to make of this, but Giovanni remembers it from the last time he went to the island and tells the other hosts they need to follow it. Over the course of the next week, the hosts follow the crow, and the next episode comes to us from the woods, where Dave made sure that the hosts watch the next episode of The Big Bang Theory and start the podcast on the recording equipment he brought. At the end of the episode, they reach the shore, and there meet Crypt and the Crow Lady, real name Gal Lee. Gal Lee explains to them about jumpers and tells Giovanni that she and Crypt helped him get to the island the first time, but that when he met Lorre, in addition to scrambling his memory, they scrambled his dimensional signature, meaning that the two of them were unable to find him or the other hosts until Dave played the song at the end of episode 19. Since Dave is a jumper, the hosts will be able to safely pass through the multidimensional veil surrounding the island, and while they do so, Dave must absorb all other Daves from all other realities. The four hosts get on board a boat with Crypt and set off for the island. The journey takes a week, and once again, Dave makes sure the four hosts watch The Big Bang Theory when the time comes. At the close of the episode, they reach the island, where Dave plays the key and takes them through the veil, during which the other three hosts also see everything, including several alternate universe faves and their podcasts, and the two-part finale of The Big Bang Theory. Once they're through, the hosts set out to find Lorre, and as they move further into the island, they do. They find Chuck Lorre's spider form, but as they confront him, as they tell it they're going to kill him, that form doesn't respond. Tess does. All along, Tess has been Chuck Lorre, or rather, Chuck Lorre has been using them as a puppet so that he can manipulate the podcast and lead the host towards what he wants to happen. If you go back and look, you can actually see the clues to when this started happening, suggesting it was around episode 8. Speaking through Tess, Lorre tells the other three hosts about his hatred of humanity and how his only relief from being constantly aware of their endless suffering is when they're watching shallow stories. He hates the idea of deep stories, stories that say something. The Great Convergence is the pathogen that will end humanity's suffering and allow them to know peace forever, existing as a captive audience for him. Dave refutes this, telling him that stories can mean something. They can give people tools to reduce the pain of their existence, to find joy, to make the world better. Lorre's been focusing on people watching his stories for as much time as possible, satiating them without providing substance. But that's not good enough. Things can be better. Then, using a beam of light composed of all the Daves in all the universes, he destroys Chuck Lorre. This releases Tess, who has no memory of anything that happened while she was under Lorre's control, and frees Bill Prady, reuniting him into a single being again. Prady tells the host that now that Lorre's gone, he will go to join his warlocks in eternal rest, but that since Lorre's been killed, no one is seated at the center of the multiverse. In preparation for the Great Convergence, Lorre's influence was so worked into the fabric of reality that without him occupying that space at the center of the multiverse, the universe will end. Prady tells the host they can prevent this if one of them takes Lorre's place. And Greg is ready to do it, but Dave says no. As long as their universe exists, Lorre's dream of complacency and accepting unjust status quos without doing anything will continue. Lorre brought them to the island because he was just as content for one of them to take his place as he was to end reality and bring it into the Great Convergence. The hosts decide not to let this happen and say their goodbyes. Reality ends. After it does, Stephen Jenkins wraps things up with a message from GenCorp. So that's Fullmetal Bazinga. The whole show, for people who will never listen, a convenient reminder for those who got confused, and a quick primer for people who don't want to go into this madness blind, although going in blind is a lot of fun if I'm being honest. The only remaining question is why? Why have I listened to this show so many times? Why did I do it in 2 days most recently? Why have I spent 9,000 words now talking about the plot, and GenCorp, and the deep lore to, let's be honest, an audience of about 20 people, if I'm lucky? I'm not saying the show is bad. It's not. The only friend I have who's listened to the whole thing disagrees with me, but I like it. I think it's good. I have enjoyed every time that I've listened, and I will doubtless enjoy every listen I undertake in the future. But it's not the kind of thing you'd expect someone to spend this much time talking about, too much time talking about. Moreover, regardless of the quality of the podcast itself, I don't know what it is about this show that keeps drawing me back to it. Something sure does. Something about this podcast is compelling and engaging in a way that clicks for me, but I do not know what it is. And I really want to figure that out. I'm gonna put Lorre back on the wall. I need him for dramatic effect. So, here's where I pull the rug out from under you. Well, if you've never listened to the podcast before and don't know anything about how it got made, here's where I pull the rug out from under you. If you've listened, you're probably wondering why I didn't bring this up before now. At the start, I said that Fullmetal Bazinga was an audio drama framed as a watch-along podcast. It's not. It's a watch-along podcast that grew a plot and became an audio drama because all of the hosts were so bored and disinterested by the show they were watching that they couldn't help invent new lore around it. And when I called it semi-scripted, it would be more accurate to say almost entirely improvised. All that lore, I explained all of this, they were coming up with it on the fly as they went, and it shows. They did put noticeable effort into trying to tie everything together and making it all fit, but there are still gaps and things that fell through the cracks. Moreover, everything I framed in the recap as the hosts discovering something, in 9 cases out of 10, that's how they came up with the information. When writing the explanations of GenCorp and the deep lore that I did at the top, I did my best to limit speculation and confine myself to things that were A, treated as fact that more than one person was aware of, like the Bazinga Museum, B, explicitly confirmed to be true later in the podcast, like speculation on the Great Convergence, or C, treated as true so consistently that treating it as speculation would make other things harder to explain. There's a lot of that last one. Anything that falls into those categories is what I would consider the canon lore of the show, and anything else I treat as things the characters came up with that turned out not to be true. But even drawing the lines there is a little bit tricky, since a lot of the times the hosts weren't on the same page about things while they were making the show. Like Carlton Billingsley. Carlton Billingsley was introduced to the show before they'd come up with GenCorp or even the idea of a third party. The explanation I gave during the plot recap is word of God from Test during the post-mortem episode that the hosts did about the whole show. And to me, it makes the most sense. But at the time, Carlton Billingsley was just a weird thing that was going to happen. The post-mortem is the first time the other hosts are hearing what Tess had in their head, and until Tess said that, Giovanni and Dave both thought of Carlton Billingsley as an agent of Lorre who came on the podcast to make it seem less credible and to fuck with them. There's also all the stuff that the hosts say with as much confidence as the things that are later confirmed, but that just never comes up again or gets tied back into things. Like, there's an entire section of episode 8 where they talk about Howard being a cyborg that I only omitted from the lore because they never bring it up again. It's never contradicted, it's just not that related to the actual plot to feel worth talking about. There are a lot of speculations about that, and particularly about GenCorp, where in a scripted show it would feel like failing to tie up loose ends or unresolved plot threads, but because of the format of this show, it's easier to approach it as just stuff the characters were brainstorming with that ended up not being true and therefore never relevant to their further investigations. But of course, if this was a scripted show, maybe there wouldn't have been those weird spars in the first place. Which kind of brings me back to that question of why. Why do I like Fullmetal Bazinga? What about this show is appealing to me? There's a few things that contribute to it. Like, I really like serialized stories that are limited in scope from the start. Fullmetal Bazinga is a one-season show, and it was always going to be one season. It's not the same thing as a book and the movie, where it's one and done. The serialized nature is important to what I find appealing about this kind of thing, but it feels like a different kind of serialized than things that are created not knowing how long they'll go on, or created with the intent of going on for as long as possible. Fullmetal Bazinga has that limited run series thing while also being paced like a 24-episode TV season, which is another thing I like about it. A lot of that is just like the episodes are tied to the release of the Big Bang Theory, and that's season 12 was a 24-episode season. But I don't know, I like it. It's good. Like, you don't experience the plot listening to the podcast. You experience the jokes and the way the hosts interact and the Pepe Sylvia of it all. And the plot just kind of seeps in around that. It feels the same as this thing that long TV seasons do, where there's an ongoing plot, but for like most of the first 2/3, that's not relevant except for the occasional scene or maybe full episode. But like the whole thing still feels worth watching. It's a very comfy kind of storytelling, I guess, but not one that I like that much most of the time. Except, as it turns out, I really like it when it exists at the same time as that like limited run series thing that Fullmetal Bazinga's got going on. fun. Some of what I normally like about limited run serialized stories has to do with everything being planned from the start. And obviously that doesn't apply to FMB, but I do think the pacing and the limited run nature of this show work together to be something I really enjoy. Another part of the appeal is that there's this hostility on the part of all the hosts to what they're doing and the fact that they have to keep doing it. It starts when the podcast is just a watch-along podcast because they all just hate the Big Bang Theory, but then it kind of carries over into their fictionalized versions of themselves that they end up playing. Like, it continues because they still hate the Big Bang Theory and they're still watching it every episode, but it then gets extended to this resentment of Chuck Lorre and of GenCorp and of all of the things that are happening to them that they just don't understand. It's fun. It's a fun energy to have around. It's committing to the bit when you all hate the bit. It's good. It's fun. Also, that energy is the only reason the show exists in this form. There's this thing that seems to happen when people force themselves to spend time with bad media, particularly bad media that is just bland and uninteresting and kind of boring. And it's that they try to make it good. I don't mean like you start convincing yourself it's secretly genius, although I don't know, probably sometimes. I mean like you start adding lore or building stuff around it to give you something to hold on to. The deep lore only exists because there was nothing worth talking about in the Big Bang Theory. An interesting comparison here is to the worst idea of all time. God, no one who watches this is going to have listened to Dada. What am I doing? This video is already so incomprehensible. Whatever, I don't care. The worst idea of all time is a series of on and off slow motion torture sessions that New Zealand comedians Tim Batt and Guy Montgomery have been inflicting upon themselves for the past 9 years. Usually this takes the form of watching the same movie every week for a year, but they branched out recently for the sake of their sanity. I have listened to every single episode, because of course I have. There's this thing that happens invariably in seasons of Twilight, where they start making up additional background information about minor characters in the movie that gets more and more intricate as time goes on and they've seen the movie more and more times. A lot of that has the same energy of Fullmetal Bazinga, down to like calling a character a warlock and consistently having names that they call the characters that are not the same as the actual names. It just never goes as far in Twilight as it does in FMB. I am convinced that this is a thing. This, we need to make it good, is just something that happens in people as a response to the frustration of a badly told story. I've seen it in more places than just FMB and Twilight. I've started doing it when I'm reading or watching something that I'm not enjoying but for some reason have to stick with. That's not what this is. This is different. This lore already exists. I'm not making anything up. I'm just explaining. This is different. This is different. Fullmetal Bazinga is good. But that quality of hostility toward their podcast subject matter, manifesting as what I can only describe as lore out of self-preservation, is the cornerstone of this podcast's mysterious hold on me. The reason I left the explanation of the behind-the-scenes stuff to now, to the last section of this video, is partially just because I thought it'd be funny, but mostly because I'm pretty sure that the way this show was made is a lot of the reason I keep coming back to it. There's other improvised or semi-scripted stuff out there that I've watched or listened to, and it's all fine. Some of it's good. But there's none of it really that I love. And at first, it might be tempting to compare Fullmetal Bazinga to Hello from the Magic Tavern, which is an entirely scripted show, except for some structuring around season finales, or the Thrilling Adventure Hour's A War of Two Worlds series, which had entirely scripted dialogue but a predetermined plot so that it could fit into existing world building. But I don't think those comparisons are totally accurate. Both of those feel like going to an improv show and watching talented improvisers tell you a fairly cohesive story that none of you are taking seriously. Fullmetal Bazinga has the energy of like the complex lore my sister and I built with our cousins when we were all kids, in which we were two sides of an interplanetary war that none of us ever acknowledged as fiction. There is an energy to listening to these four people come up with this story in real time without ever breaking kayfabe that I don't think I've seen literally anywhere else. Part of it is that it's easier than usual to see the gears, so to speak, of the story, to see the things that make it work and how it all fits together, and I find that really interesting. But most of it is honestly that it's just a fun experience to be taken along on. It's the specific feeling of this whole thing not being intentional and not being what you signed up for when you started listening that I enjoy about the podcast, and it makes it feel different from other improvised stuff I've watched or listened to. Basically, my main point, if a video this bloated can be said to have one, is that Fullmetal Bazinga is good because it was never planned out, and the story would not be most of the things I like about it if it had been. Like, GenCorp, the thing that is so important that it got its own lore section, that only exists because David Blam didn't want to remember any of the deep lore the four of them were coming up with. Early on, he would deliberately approach each episode with a blank slate and like not remember anything as if it was just a normal show. Until it got too far in for him to keep doing that, after which he started just attributing things to the third party as a way of keeping it simple for himself. The name, Stephen Jenkins, is something Dave just said without knowing where it came from or why he said it, and then ended up forming an ongoing Easter egg in the show that's really well done. I was talking to my friend Kat about this. Hi Kat, thank you for listening to all of Fullmetal Bazinga for me. In exchange, you get to be in the video. And she mentioned that she thought the podcast would have been better if the four hosts had sat down and once they realized it wasn't going to be a typical watch-along podcast, planned out all of the lore and everything so they were on the same page. And like, I get it. Kat, you're right, that would have been a more cohesive show, but the more I've been thinking about that conversation, the more I think it would not be a better show. Aside from the fact that they were never going to be able to plan out everything because they were still making it along with the Big Bang Theory season 12 and had to tie everything back into each episode as it came out, I just genuinely don't think the story would have been as interesting if they planned it all out in advance. Like, I think the lore would be more consistent and straightforward, and I think there'd be fewer loose ends, but I don't think the show would be better. I don't think that the story these four people would have planned out around, say, episode 5, when they first started talking about the deep lore in earnest, would have managed to be everything I like about the Fullmetal Bazinga that currently exists. I do think that these four people could make a story that they planned out in its entirety that is better than Fullmetal Bazinga, possibly partially because of the stuff they learned while making FMB. But so much of the best parts of this show, for me, come from the spontaneity of making it up on the fly without a net and the limitations that the rules set on them. I don't think you get GenCorp's Fireside Chat or Greg's Noir Detective episode, two of the only fully scripted episodes of the podcast, without all the weird improvised nonsense they had to pull from and stay consistent with. I know you don't get the weird Stephen Jenkins Easter eggs because the name Stephen Jenkins wouldn't have come up, wouldn't have been said. And I think we just sort of feel kind of done before, less special than the product we ended up getting. I think it would have been a little bit more like everything else, and all of the uniqueness that draws me to it would have been gone. Okay, it's not a story that seems normal at first, and then is revealed to get weird and sinister. It's a story that is normal, and then gets weird as a surprise to the people making it. That doesn't happen if you plan it, and I don't think you can pull that off with a script. Yes, Fullmetal Bazinga is a little bit of a mess the first time you listen, arguably even on subsequent listens. For much of the run, the hosts did not talk to each other about the lore except on mic as they were coming up with it, a situation which did not allow for editing because of the timer on each episode. That sounds like chaos, but the chaos is, I think, what I like about it. Fullmetal Bazinga is good because of the chaos in which it was created, not in spite of it. It is good because it was never supposed to be what it ended up becoming. It is good because so much of it is completely unplanned. That doesn't mean that those same features are going to be what everyone else likes about it. They may in fact be the thing that means it's not for you. But if we're answering the question of why I specifically like Fullmetal Bazinga, and why I keep coming back to it, then I think that's why. Also, I just like going lightly insane while immersing myself in lore, and it's just more fun the less sense it makes and the sillier I can sound while doing it. That's it, that's the video. May the young Sheldon have mercy on us all.
You would step back from that ledge, my friend. You could cut ties with all the lies that you've been living in. And if you do not want to see me again, I will understand.